They told you Africa had no history, no empires, no glory, no civilization worth remembering. They told you it was a continent of darkness, waiting to be discovered, waiting to be saved. But what if everything you were taught was a deliberate lie? What if Africa did not need saving because Africa had already built some of the most powerful, most sophisticated, most extraordinary civilizations this world has ever seen? This is not a story they put in your textbooks, but it is the truth. Long before European ships appeared on the horizon, long before borders were drawn with rulers on maps by men who had never set foot on African soil, long before the slave ships, the missionaries, and the colonial administrators, Africa was already a world unto itself. A world of kings and queens who commanded armies of hundreds of thousands. A world of scholars who wrote libraries of knowledge while Europe stumbled through its dark ages. A world of engineers who raised stone cities so precise, so vast, that later visitors refused to believe Africans had built them. In this documentary, we go back. We go back to 5 civilizations that rewrote what it means to be powerful. The Mali Empire, whose wealth collapsed global gold markets. The Songhai Empire, which controlled more land than Western Europe combined. The Kingdom of Kush, whose warrior queen humiliated the Roman army. The Kingdom of Zimbabwe, which built a stone city of 18,000 people without a single drop of mortar. And Ethiopia, the one nation on the African continent that looked a European colonial army in the eye and sent it home in defeat. These are not myths. These are not legends. These are documented, verified archaeological and historical facts. If no one ever told you this story, stay, because once you know this, you cannot unknow it. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. This is history that will not be silenced. In the year 1324, a king left his palace in West Africa and began a journey to Mecca. He traveled with an entourage of 60,000 men. 12,000 of those men were slaves, each carrying 4 pounds of gold dust. 80 camels carried 300 pounds of gold each. His name was Mansa Musa, and by the time he reached Cairo, he had so freely distributed gold that the Egyptian economy did not recover for 12 years. The modern equivalent of the wealth Mansa Musa controlled, adjusted for inflation and the global value of gold, is estimated by economists at $400 billion. No human being in recorded history has ever been wealthier. But Mansa Musa did not build the Mali Empire. He inherited a civilization that had already been forged in fire. It began with a man named Sundiata Keita. In the early 12th century, the Soso king Sumanguru Kante dominated West Africa through military force and terror. He had crushed the remnants of the old Ghana Empire and subjugated the Mandinka people. Sundiata, son of a Mandinka chief, was considered an unlikely challenger. As a child, he could not walk, but he rose. He formed a coalition of West African states, and at the Battle of Kirina in 1235, Sundiata defeated Sumanguru Kante and founded the Mali Empire. What followed was 2 centuries of extraordinary governance. The Mali Empire stretched across an area larger than Western Europe. It controlled the most important commodity in the medieval world, gold. The gold fields of Bambouk and Bouré fed trade networks that stretched north across the Sahara to Morocco, east to Egypt, and by extension into the markets of the Mediterranean. At the heart of this empire sat the city of Timbuktu. Today, the word is used as a metaphor for the ends of the earth, somewhere impossibly far and irrelevant. But in the 14th and 15th centuries, Timbuktu was one of the most important cities on the planet. It had a population of 100,000 people. It housed the Sankore Mosque, which functioned as a university with 25,000 students. 180 Quranic schools operated within the city. Scholars came from North Africa, the Middle East, and across sub-Saharan Africa to study mathematics, astronomy, medicine, law, and theology. The manuscripts produced in Timbuktu, 700,000 of which survive today, contain detailed astronomical charts, advanced algebraic formulas, and sophisticated medical diagnoses. These were not primitive scribblings. They were the output of one of the greatest centers of learning the medieval world had ever produced. The Mali Empire began to fragment after Mansa Musa's death. Succession disputes, Tuareg raids, and the rise of a new power in the east would eventually pull it apart. But from its ruins, something even larger was about to rise. When the Mali Empire weakened, the Songhai people of the Niger Bend saw their opportunity. They had long been subjects of Mali. Now they would be its successors, and they would build something far larger. The man who built it was Suni Ari Ber, who came to power in 1464. He was above all else a military commander of exceptional skill. He understood that control of the Niger River meant control of West Africa. He built a war canoe navy, the first significant river navy in sub-Saharan African history. He used it to take the city of Timbuktu in 1468 and the city of Djenné after a 7-year siege that ended in 1473. By the time Suni Ali Ber died in 1992, the same year Columbus was making landfall in the Caribbean, the Songhai Empire was the largest state in African history. It stretched from the Atlantic coast in the west to what is now Nigeria in the east. Historians estimate it covered an area of approximately 1.4 million square kilometers. After Suni Ali's death, a general named Askia Mohammed, also known as Askia the Great, seized power and took the empire to its administrative peak. Askia the Great was not primarily a conqueror, he was a builder of institutions. He divided the empire into provinces, each governed by an appointed administrator accountable to the central government. He standardized weights and measures across the empire's vast markets. He appointed judges based on Islamic law to bring legal consistency. He created a professional standing army, distinct from the civilian population, among the earliest examples of a professional military in sub-Saharan Africa. Under Askia, Timbuktu flourished as never before. Scholars were protected and patronized, trade flowed, taxes were collected and redistributed. The empire functioned with a degree of administrative sophistication that rivaled any contemporary state in the world.
But the Songhai Empire met its end in a way that would change African history permanently. In 1591, the Moroccan Sultan Ahmad al-Mansur dispatched an invasion force of 4,000 soldiers, armed with muskets and artillery, across the Sahara Desert. The Songhai had cavalry, archers, and vast numbers, but they had never faced firearms en masse. At the Battle of Tondibi, the Songhai army of approximately 40,000 men was routed by the Moroccan force, not because they lacked courage, not because they lacked numbers, but because the introduction of gunpowder weapons had fundamentally changed the nature of warfare, and the Songhai had not yet acquired them in meaningful quantities. The fall of Songhai was not the failure of African civilization. It was the collision of two eras of military technology and a warning about what was coming across the entire continent. Most people know Egypt, but fewer know the civilization that conquered Egypt, that produced more pyramids than Egypt, and that sent a warrior queen to face down the Roman Empire. The Kingdom of Kush, centered in what is today Sudan, is one of the oldest civilizations in human history. Archaeological evidence at the site of Kerma, the ancient Kushite capital, dates continuous urban settlement to at least 2400 BCE. At a time when much of the world was still organizing into small tribal units, Kush was already a kingdom with monumental architecture, long-distance trade, and centralized political authority. The relationship between Kush and Egypt was complex, contentious, and mutual. Nubian archers served in Egyptian armies for centuries. Egyptian and Nubian cultures borrowed from each other across thousands of years of interaction. But in the 8th century BCE, the power dynamic shifted decisively. The Kushite king Pai invaded Egypt in 747 BCE, defeated the fragmented Egyptian rulers, and united the Nile Valley under Kushite authority. His successors, known as the 25th dynasty, ruled Egypt for nearly a century. These were the Black Pharaohs, Pai, Shabaka, Shibitku, Taharka, and Tantamani. Under Taharka in particular, Egypt experienced a cultural and architectural renaissance. Taharka built and restored temples across Egypt and Sudan, and is mentioned in the Bible in the 2nd book of Kings as a king who challenged the Assyrian Empire. After the Assyrians eventually pushed the Kushite pharaohs back south, the kingdom of Kush did not collapse, it endured. Its capital moved to Meroe, and a new era of Kushite civilization flourished for 6 more centuries. The Meroitic pyramids, over 200 of them compared to Egypt's 100, still stand today in the Sudanese desert, largely unknown to the general public. And then there was Queen Amani-Renis. In 25 BCE, the Roman Empire, at the height of its power under Augustus Caesar, occupied Egypt and began pressing south into Kushite territory, imposing heavy taxation on the border regions. The Romans assumed the Kushites would submit, as so many others had. They were wrong. Queen Amani-Renis, the Kandake, or Queen Mother of the Meroitic Kingdom, led her army north. Her forces stormed the Roman-held town of Syene, the island of Elephantine, and the city of Philae. They tore down statues of Augustus Caesar and carried one of his bronze heads back to Meroe, where it was buried beneath the steps of a temple, so that every person who entered would walk over the face of the Roman emperor.
Rome sent a counterforce. Battles were fought. But Amani-Renis, who had lost one eye in the fighting and continued to command, negotiated a peace treaty directly with Augustus Caesar that was entirely favorable to Kush. Rome withdrew. The taxes were lifted. No Roman force ever successfully invaded Kushite territory again. History forgot her name for centuries. We will not. In the 11th century, in what is today the country that bears its name, construction began on one of the most remarkable structures in the history of the African continent. Great Zimbabwe was a city, a capital, a commercial hub. Its stone enclosures, the largest of which has walls 11 meters high and over 250 meters in circumference, were built from approximately 11 million pieces of granite, shaped and fitted together with such precision that no mortar was required. The walls have stood for 900 years. At its height in the 14th century, Great Zimbabwe housed approximately 18,000 people. It was the center of a trading state that exported gold and ivory north to the Swahili coast and from there to Persia, India, and China. Chinese porcelain and Persian pottery have been found in the ruins. Arabian coins. The evidence of a civilization plugged into global trade networks centuries before European ships reached southern Africa. When European colonizers arrived in the 19th century and saw Great Zimbabwe, many refused to accept that Africans had built it. They proposed without evidence that it had been built by Phoenicians or by the Queen of Sheba or by Arabs. These claims were motivated by ideology, not archaeology. Modern excavation and carbon dating have confirmed definitively that Great Zimbabwe was built and inhabited by the Shona people, the ancestors of the people who live in Zimbabwe today. Further south, in the early 19th century, a military and political revolution was underway that would produce one of the most formidable fighting forces in African history. Shaka Kasenzangana, known to history as Shaka Zulu, came to lead the Zulu clan in 1816. At that time, the Zulus were a minor group in a fragmented political landscape. Within a decade, Shaka had transformed them into a regional superpower through a combination of military innovation, diplomatic coercion, and the systematic absorption of neighboring groups. His military reforms were revolutionary. He standardized the short stabbing spear, the iklua, replacing the traditional longer throwing assegai. He introduced the cow horn formation, impondo zankomo, in which the central body engaged the enemy frontally while two flanking columns moved to encircle them. He abolished the use of sandals to toughen his soldiers' feet for rapid movement. He created age-based military regiments, amabuto, that trained together, lived together, and fought together, creating units of extraordinary cohesion. By the time of his death in 1828, the Zulu kingdom controlled most of what is today KwaZulu-Natal. But it was the generation after Shaka that delivered the most dramatic demonstration of Zulu military power. On the 22nd of January, 1879, at a place called Isandlwana, a British imperial force of approximately 1,700 soldiers, equipped with modern rifles and artillery, was attacked by a Zulu army of approximately 20,000 warriors. The British had recently invaded Zulu territory in what they expected to be a swift colonial suppression campaign. The Zulus executed Shaka's bullhorn formation with textbook precision. The British force was encircled, overwhelmed, and destroyed. Over 1,300 British and Allied troops died in a matter of hours. It remains one of the most catastrophic defeats ever suffered by the British Army. The Zulus did it with spears.
By the end of the 19th century, the scramble for Africa was complete. At the Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885, the European powers had divided an entire continent among themselves, drawing borders across kingdoms, splitting ethnic groups, and erasing political systems that had existed for centuries. Of the 50-plus countries in Africa, only one emerged from that era with its sovereignty fully intact: Ethiopia. To understand why, you must first understand what Ethiopia was. The Aksumite Empire, the predecessor state centered in northern Ethiopia and Eritrea, was one of the four great powers of the ancient world. The Roman historian Malani listed Aksum alongside Rome, Persia, and China as one of the four kingdoms worthy of the title Great Power. Aksum controlled the strategic Red Sea trade routes connecting the Mediterranean to India. It minted its own gold coins. It developed a unique writing system, Giyas, that is still used in Ethiopian Orthodox Christian liturgy today. It was one of the earliest states in the world to adopt Christianity as its official religion, doing so in the 4th century CE under King Izana, roughly the same period as the Roman Emperor Constantine. This ancient identity, rooted in a continuous civilization stretching back over 2,000 years, gave Ethiopia a sense of national and cultural cohesion that proved decisive when the colonial threat arrived. In 1895, the Kingdom of Italy, which had established a colonial foothold in the Horn of Africa, claimed that a treaty signed with Ethiopia, the Treaty of Wuchale, gave Italy a protectorate over the entire country. Emperor Menelik II read the Amharic version of the treaty. The two versions said different things. Italy had inserted a clause in the Italian text that was absent in the Amharic version. Menelik rejected Italy's interpretation, repudiated the treaty, and began preparing for war. He mobilized over 100,000 soldiers. the largest African army assembled to face a European colonial force in the entire history of the scramble for Africa. His wife, Empress Tetu Betul, was not merely a figurehead. She commanded her own contingent of soldiers and played an active strategic role in the campaign. Ethiopian oral tradition and historical record both credit her with decisive contributions to the war effort. On the 1st of March, 1896, at the town of Adwa in northern Ethiopia, the Ethiopian and Italian forces met in open battle. The Italian force of approximately 17,000 men was routed. Over 6,000 Italian soldiers were killed. 3 Italian generals were killed or captured. It was the most decisive defeat of a European colonial army by an African force in the entire colonial era. The consequences were immediate and global. Italy was forced to sign the Treaty of Addis Ababa, recognizing Ethiopian sovereignty unconditionally. The news spread across the African diaspora and the colonized world like fire. In the United States, African-American newspapers reported the victory with undisguised celebration. In the Caribbean, Haiti, itself a nation born from a successful slave rebellion, saw Ethiopia's victory as confirmation that African people could and would resist. Ethiopia had not just won a battle, it had proved a truth that the architects of colonialism had worked hard to deny, that African civilization was not inferior, that African military strategy was not primitive, that African sovereignty was not a gift to be granted by European powers, it was a right to be defended. 5 civilizations, 5 separate points on a continent of 30 million square kilometers, separated by geography, by language, by religion, by centuries of time, and yet connected by a common thread.
Each of these civilizations built administrative systems sophisticated enough to govern millions of people across vast distances. Each developed trade networks that connected Africa to the wider world. Each produced military institutions capable of projecting power across entire regions. Each generated written records, legal codes, and systems of scholarship that documented and preserved human knowledge. These were not primitive societies. They were not pre-civilizational. They were not waiting for someone to come and show them how to organize human life. They were already there, at the summit. The Kingdom of Mali collapsed not because it lacked sophistication, but because of internal succession wars and external military pressure. The Songhai Empire fell not because of cultural inferiority, but because gunpowder warfare had arrived in Africa before African states had fully armed themselves with it. The Kingdom of Kush endured for over 3,000 years before being absorbed into a changing political landscape. Great Zimbabwe was abandoned, historians believe due to ecological pressures and the shifting of trade routes, not because its people were incapable of sustaining it. And Ethiopia, the one that held on because it understood itself, its history, its identity, its sovereignty, with a clarity that no invading army could dissolve. Colonization did not civilize Africa, it interrupted it. The slave trade removed an estimated 12 to 15 million people from the African continent over 4 centuries, the most productive, the most able-bodied, the builders and farmers and soldiers. Colonialism extracted natural resources, dismantled existing political systems, imposed artificial borders that cut across ethnic and cultural lines, and then departed, leaving behind states that were structurally engineered to fail. The poverty, the instability, the conflict that fills Western news coverage of Africa today, these are not the natural condition of the African continent. They are the legacy of a deliberate, systematic, and extraordinarily violent interruption.
The gold of Mali, the armies of Songhai, the pyramids of Kush, the walls of Zimbabwe, the sovereignty of Ethiopia. None of these have been erased. They are waiting to be remembered. And remembering them is not an act of nostalgia. It is an act of truth. If this history matters to you, share it. Share it with someone who was never taught this. Share it with someone who grew up being told that African history began with colonization. Because it did not. It began thousands of years before. And it is extraordinary. Subscribe to this channel. Because we are just getting started. There are 100 more stories that were buried, erased, and deliberately forgotten. And we will tell every single one of them. The truth does not disappear. It does not fade. It waits for someone with the courage to speak it. We just did.